Courtroom doors swung open with a sharp, hollow crack that echoed through the silent chamber. On the defendant's bench sat an aging black man, his hair gone gray, his janitor's uniform still bearing yesterday's paint stain. He had no lawyer. No one had come to see him. The community had turned its back. Then 3 women walked in, one in a sharp black blazer, one cradling a thick stack of files, one in glasses with eyes like cut glass. They sat in the front row. The man looked up confused. He did not recognize them. There is a painful truth about this world. We tend to measure a person's worth by the clothes they wear, the car they drive, the address on their mail. So some people, even after living an entire life of decency, remain invisible to everyone around them. Until one day the truth about them forces the world to stop and look. The story unfolding here is one of those stories. For 22 years, Samuel Carter had pushed a mop down the long tile corridors of St. Mary's High School in a quiet town outside Cincinnati. And at 58, he could feel each one of those years in his lower back when he stood up too fast in the morning. The students who passed him in the hallway rarely looked up from their phones. His co-workers called him the old man with the bucket. But Samuel knew the name of every child who cried in the bathroom stall on a Tuesday afternoon, and he kept peppermint candies in his coat pocket for any of them who needed one. He kept Eleanor's photograph in a small wooden frame on the kitchen counter, and every morning before he turned on the coffee pot, he greeted her by name. Eleanor had been his wife. She had been struck by a car on a wet October night, a quarter of a century earlier, on her way home from a late shift at the hospital. The driver had never been found, the official report said. Samuel had buried her on a Tuesday and gone back to work on a Wednesday because there was rent to pay and no one else to pay it. It was 1 week to the day after that funeral on another rainy October night when Samuel walked home from the late shift and heard something in an alley behind a closed grocery store. 3 little girls were huddled under a torn awning soaked through to the skin. The oldest, a fierce-eyed child of maybe 10, threw her arm out in front of the 2 smaller ones, twin sisters of 5 who clung to each other like one body. Their mother, the older girl, would say, later had walked away that afternoon and promised to come back. She had not. Samuel knelt down slowly in the rain. The oldest girl raised something in her shaking hand and said, "Don't come closer. I have a knife." It was a plastic spoon. A small laugh escaped Samuel's throat, the first laugh he had managed since the funeral. He took off his coat and draped it over all 3 of them. He walked them home in silence. At his kitchen table, he warmed a pot of plain rice porridge, the only thing his cupboards held that night. The 2 younger ones, Grace and Abigail, ate in big, grateful gulps. The oldest, Hannah, did not touch a single spoonful. She sat upright in her chair until dawn, watching him. In the morning, Samuel reached for his old suitcase to take them to the children's home across town. He took Grace's small hand to lead her toward the door. And the little girl, looking up at him with rain-puffed eyes, asked in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Are you going to hit us?" He stood frozen in the doorway. He stood there for what felt like a year. Then he set the suitcase down on the wooden floor. He turned to the 3 of them, and in a voice that was barely his own, he said, "I'm not taking you anywhere." The strangest thing about human beings the longer one lives is not their cruelty, but their kindness. Cruelty can be explained. It comes from fear, from selfishness, from old wounds that never closed. But kindness, the kind that makes a man who has just buried his wife with nothing in his cupboard but rice open his door to 3 strangers' children, that kind of kindness has no logical explanation. It does not come from the mind. It comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere the world has not yet learned to name. The years that followed were not easy. Samuel made $42,000 a year, and there was never enough of anything. He learned to divide a single piece of meat into 3 portions, taking none for himself, eating his rice with soy sauce and pretending it was a feast. He learned to sew patches into school uniforms, so the other children at the bus stop would not see the holes. He learned to stand at the back of every classroom on parents' day hat in his hands, smiling at his daughters from a respectful distance because he was afraid his work coat would embarrass them. Hannah caught him one evening when she was 12, eating only rice and soy sauce while she had pork chop on her plate. Without a word, she slid her piece of meat into his bowl. Without a word, he slid it back into hers. They had a small, silent war over that pork chop for most of dinner, and when she finally gave up and ate it, Samuel finished his rice with the look of a man who had won something important. On Grace's first day of school, Samuel wore the only suit he owned, a brown jacket 2 sizes too big, given to him by a custodian who had retired the year before. The other children in the hallway stared at the two of them. One little boy, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, asked, "Why is your dad black if you're white?" Grace gripped Samuel's hand so hard her knuckles turned pale, and she shouted back in the high, clear voice of a 6-year-old, "Because my dad is my dad." Abigail was different. Abigail was fire. At 16, she came home past curfew smelling of cigarettes and somebody else's cologne. When Samuel told her she could not go out the next weekend, she screamed something at him that would echo in his ears for the next 2 decades. "You're not even my real father!" She slammed the door behind her so hard a picture frame rattled off the wall. Samuel sat on the porch step in the cold, his coat pulled tight, and he waited. She came back at 4 in the morning with her mascara smeared and her bravery gone. He did not raise his voice. He did not lecture her. He went into the kitchen, warmed a slice of buttered toast and a mug of milk, and set them down in front of her at the table. He said only, "You must be hungry." When Hannah graduated from law school, Samuel stood at the very back of the auditorium because he did not trust his old shoes to walk down the aisle without squeaking. She gave the student address. From the podium looking out over the crowd, she said into the microphone, "I would like to thank the man who shares no blood with me, but who has given me everything." She found him with her eyes all the way at the back. He cried very quietly in a row of strangers who never noticed. And then they grew up, and Samuel did the strangest, kindest thing a father can do. He pushed them away. He was afraid his poverty would weigh them down. He was afraid the smell of bleach on his sleeves would cling to their futures. Every check they mailed him, he mailed back with a folded note that said only, "I'm fine. Take care of your own life now." Every time they tried to come home for the holidays, he told them work was busy, the house was a mess, the weather was bad, anything he could think of to keep their lives moving forward without him in the way. Hannah went to a corporate law firm in Boston, the kind with marble lobbies and floor-to-ceiling windows. She became precise, controlled, sealed off, calling her father once a year on Thanksgiving for conversations that never lasted longer than 3 minutes. Grace stayed in the Midwest and worked as an auditor at a mid-sized accounting firm in Indianapolis. She wrote her father a letter every single month, neat handwriting on cream stationery, but she could never bring herself to drive the 4 hours home. She was afraid of what the years had done to his face. Abigail moved to Chicago and became a private investigator, a job she said suited her because it required her to trust no one. She had not spoken her father's name aloud in 7 years. She had never apologized for what she had said at 16. The shame of that night had grown around her heart like a vine, and she did not know how to cut it down. There are fathers who do not need their children beside them. They only need to know their children are living well. And there are children who do not understand that a father's distance is not absence, it is fear. Fear of being a burden. And by the time many of those children come to understand this, it can already be too late to say thank you. But it is not yet too late to come home. In the fall of that year, St. Mary's hired a new chief financial officer. His name was Richard Hales. He was 60 years old, white-haired, lean, expensively dressed with the kind of polished smile that made people lean toward him without noticing they were doing it. In his second week on the job, he found Samuel in the supply closet, coffee in hand, and asked how Samuel took his black no sugar, and from that morning on, every Tuesday, there was a paper cup waiting for him on the supply cart. Richard asked about Samuel's daughters. Richard asked about his back. After about a month, Richard offered to help Samuel open a new checking account since the old one was charging him monthly fees he could not afford. Samuel was moved. It had been a long time since anyone above him in the building had treated him like a man rather than like a fixture in the wall. He signed the papers Richard placed in front of him. He shook Richard's hand. He went home that night, and he told Eleanor's photograph on the counter that maybe the world was getting kinder after all. What Samuel did not know, what no one in the building knew, was that the man pouring his coffee on Tuesday mornings had been driving the car that killed Eleanor Carter on that rainy October night, a quarter of a century earlier. The accident had been quietly resolved by Richard's family, who had old money and old lawyers and the right phone numbers in the right pockets. But Richard had spent all those years afraid that one day the past would walk down a hallway and recognize him. When he took the job at St. Mary's and saw the name Samuel Carter on a janitor's payroll record, the fear became unbearable. He decided he would not wait for the truth to find him. He would bury the man first. It happened on a Monday morning in early March. The school's scholarship fund, $240,000 set aside over the years for low-income students, had vanished over the weekend. The security camera in the finance wing had failed during the exact window of the transfer. The receiving account belonged to one Samuel Carter. The account had been opened only 2 months earlier. There was a signed authorization form bearing his name in clear, careful letters. The signature was forged. The forgery was very good. 2 uniformed officers walked into the hallway between second and third period and asked him to step outside. Students stopped where they stood, phones already raised. Samuel, still holding his mop, did not understand. He kept asking in a voice that grew smaller with each question what he had done. The handcuffs went on in front of the cafeteria, while teenagers he had cleaned up after for years filmed him. By dinner time, the local paper had the headline, "Black School Janitor, Accused of Stealing Children's Scholarship Fund." The community's outrage was instant and total. Neighbors who had waved at him for years suddenly closed their blinds when his car came into view. The pastor at his church called the congregation to pray for the children who had been robbed. Samuel sat in a holding cell at the county station with his hands folded in his lap. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call his daughters. He did not call anyone. He could not bear the thought of any of them seeing him this way. In life, there are people who love us so quietly that we begin to believe they do not need us at all. There are fathers who spend an entire lifetime giving and never once ask to receive. If you are fortunate enough to still have such a person in your life, a father, a mother, an old teacher, anyone who loved you when you had nothing to offer them in return, please do not wait until they are in trouble to come home. A short phone call, a shared meal, a simple question about how their day has been. These small things are worth more than any expensive gift you will ever buy. Because there are debts of love in this world that life does not always give us the time to repay. The first night in the holding cell, Samuel sat with his back against the cinder block wall and watched a single fluorescent tube hum overhead. He thought about Eleanor the way he always did when he had nowhere else to put his mind. He asked her very quietly what he had done wrong. He thought about his 3 girls and felt something close to gratitude that they were far away in their grown-up lives, that they would not have to see him like this. He told himself over and over that they must not find out. A young man 2 bunks down asked him what he was in for. Samuel gave a small, tired smile and said, "I'm still trying to figure that out myself." He did not cry. The men in his generation, the men who had raised 3 daughters alone on a janitor's wage, had long ago lost the habit of crying for themselves. The newspaper that broke the story had a digital edition by sunrise. By 8 in the morning, it was sitting on Hannah's desk in Boston. She was in the middle of signing a merger document worth more than $70 million when her assistant slipped the printout in front of her. Her pen stopped above the page. She read the headline once. She read it twice. Her face did not move. The men across the conference table noticed nothing. She finished her signature with a steady hand, capped her pen, and said calmly to her assistant, "Cancel everything next week. I have a family matter." It was the first time in 9 years that she had used the word family in that office. Grace was sitting at a small cafe on her lunch break, scrolling through the news on her phone when she saw her father's photograph. The cup of coffee in her hand slipped out of her fingers and shattered on the tile. She did not notice. She was already crying, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere too deep to control the kind that turns strangers around. A woman at the next table thought she had just been broken up with. She wanted to say something kind. Grace stood up before she could and walked out of the cafe into the afternoon, leaving her purse on the chair. Abigail was in her car on a stakeout when the alert came across her phone. She read 3 lines of the article and brought her fist down on the steering wheel so hard the horn blared across the parking lot. She sat there for 10 minutes after that, perfectly still, her hand throbbing. Then she did something she had not done in 4 years. She picked up the phone and dialed her older sister. When Hannah answered, Abigail's voice came out raw and small. "Hannah, I have to go home." They met at the county jail 3 days later. The visiting room had a long row of plexiglass partitions and metal stools bolted to the floor. The 3 of them sat in a row waiting. When Samuel was led in on the other side of the glass, he did not recognize them at first. The years had passed in long, uneven stretches since he had really seen any of them. Hannah's hair was cut short now, and she wore a tailored charcoal blazer that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Grace had glasses and a softness in her face that the years had only deepened. Abigail had a small black tattoo on the inside of her wrist that he had never seen before. He looked at them for a few seconds, and then he looked down at his hands and he said in a low voice, "I think you ladies have the wrong man." Hannah pressed the flat of her palm against the glass between them. "Dad, it's me, Hannah." Samuel began to tremble. The trembling started in his fingers and spread up into his shoulders, but what he said next was not what they expected. "Girls, go home. Don't get pulled into this. I'm fine. Don't let this ruin your careers. Don't let this ruin your lives." Abigail let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. "You're pushing us away. Again. After all these years, you're still doing it." It was the first time she had cried in front of him since she was 16 years old. Grace pressed her own palm to the glass beside Hannah's. Her voice was so soft it almost did not carry. "Daddy, we're not going anywhere. This time you have to let us stay." Outside the visiting room, in a long hallway lined with vending machines and tired families, the 3 of them held one another for the first time in many years. They did not speak. There was nothing yet to say. By the next morning, they had divided the war. Hannah took the legal front. She had built her career on mergers and contract law, on rooms full of men in expensive suits, and she had never argued a criminal case in her life. She bought 4 textbooks and stayed up for 2 nights straight reading them. She was harder on herself than any opposing counsel could have been. By day 3, she was harder on her sisters too. She drew up an 18-hour daily schedule for the 3 of them and pinned it to the kitchen wall of their father's old house. And when Grace asked gently if maybe everyone could sleep 1 extra hour, Hannah looked up from her laptop with red eyes and said, "He didn't get to sleep an extra hour for 2 decades. We don't either." Grace stopped asking after that, but a small ache settled into her chest that would not go away. Grace took the financial front. The $240,000 had not vanished, it had only changed clothes. She tracked it through a maze of 7 shell companies registered in Delaware and Bermuda, each layer scrubbed cleaner than the last. By the end of the first week, she had the destination. The money had eventually settled in a private investment account belonging to Richard Hales. She circled the name in red marker. Her hand was shaking when she did it. Abigail took the field. Her work as a private investigator had taught her things about locks and service entrances that most school administrators would not want to hear, and she let herself into the building one night through a delivery door at the back of the kitchen. The security system in the finance wing was newer, but every system has the same weakness, which is the human being who sets it up. She found what she was looking for in the camera log. The cameras had not failed at all. They had been turned off manually from an administrator account for exactly 47 minutes, from 11:13 at night until midnight on the dot. The administrator account belonged to Richard Hales. Hannah needed to see the man with her own eyes. She called him from a number he did not recognize, introduced herself as a distant cousin of Samuel's who wanted to make peace and avoid a public scandal, and she invited him to coffee at a hotel lobby downtown. Richard came in a navy cashmere coat smelling of expensive aftershave, and he was sorry. He was so sorry. He told her he had always liked Samuel. He told her the financial pressure of 3 grown daughters must have finally cracked the man. He shook his head sadly into his espresso and said it broke his heart to see it. Hannah had spent nearly a decade reading the faces of men in conference rooms. She knew the difference between a face that was sorry and a face that was performing sorry. She also knew where to look. While Richard talked, she let the conversation wander, and somewhere between his second and third sip of coffee, she said the name very lightly. It must have been so difficult for him after losing his wife. Eleanor Carter, I think her name was. Richard's right eyelid twitched. It was the smallest movement a face could make, and still be called a movement. He did not notice that it had happened. Hannah noticed. That night, she drove out to her father's old house, the one he had raised them in, and she opened the cedar chest at the foot of his bedroom closet for the first time in many years. Inside were Eleanor's things. Among them was a folder of newspaper clippings, and one official document. Samuel had never been able to throw away the police report from the night of the accident. The license plate of the vehicle that struck Eleanor was partially obscured by mud and rain, but 3 letters on the front of the plate were legible. Hannah called Abigail at 2 in the morning and read the partial plate and the year over the phone. By sunrise, Abigail had run it through the license databases that her investigators' credentials gave her legitimate access to. One match came back a black sedan registered to a Richard Hales in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Cincinnati. Hannah sat on the floor of her father's bedroom for a long time, holding the printout in both hands, and she understood for the first time that this was no longer only about a stolen scholarship fund. Some old wounds never truly heal. They only fall asleep waiting for someone to say the right name and wake them up. Sometimes justice for the present begins with a truth that was buried in the past. The universe has a quiet way of straightening what has been bent. It only needs time, and it needs people who are willing to walk all the way to the end of the road, however long the road turns out to be. Richard was not a stupid man. By the second week, he understood that someone was looking into him, and he understood roughly who that someone was. So he moved first. A confidential personnel file from Hannah's law firm in Boston appeared in the inbox of a regional newspaper with a long anonymous note suggesting that she was unethically representing a family member in a criminal matter while still an employee of a corporate firm. Within 48 hours, the Bar Association had opened a preliminary inquiry. 2 days after that, an unannounced audit team showed up at Grace's accounting office in Indianapolis, claiming a tip about irregularities in her recent client work. Every file on her desk and every drive in her cabinet was sealed in evidence bags by the end of the morning. She watched her own work being carried out in plastic bins, and she felt the floor go soft beneath her feet. Abigail was driving home from her father's house at 1 in the morning on a back road when a black SUV with no license plate came up fast behind her and pushed her car off into a ditch. Her right wrist snapped against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. The SUV did not stop. It did not even slow down. She lay against the deflating airbag in the dark, her arm on fire, and she heard herself laughing through the tears because she finally knew with absolute certainty that they were on the right track. I have lived long enough to understand a bitter thing about this country. The legal system, which was built to protect the weak, has too often become an instrument in the hands of those with money. A poor man accused of something usually needs 6 months to prove he is innocent. A rich man who is guilty sometimes needs only 6 hours to be released. That is not law. That is inequality dressed up in a black robe. And it is the reason that sometimes justice does not arrive on its own. It arrives only when there are people brave enough to drag it through the door. The trial date, was now 5 days away. The night before the final hearing, the three sisters sat together in the living room of the old house. Abigail's right wrist was in a cast. Hannah had not slept in 30 hours. Grace had a thin tremor in her hands that would not stop. Hannah was opening boxes in the closet looking for a particular file when she came across a shoebox tied with kitchen twine. Inside it were photographs. There was a photograph of the four of them at a state park, Samuel standing behind the three girls with one hand on each of his oldest daughter's shoulders. There was Grace in her cap and gown at her high school graduation, smiling so wide her eyes had almost closed. There was Abigail at her 18th birthday party, except Abigail was not in the picture, only a cake on the kitchen table and a single empty chair. She had not come home that night. She had been in Chicago, sleeping on a friend's couch, telling herself she did not care. Abigail picked up the photograph of the empty chair, and her shoulders began to shake. She put her face into her good hand. "I told him he wasn't my real father," she said to no one in particular. "I never apologized. All these years, I never apologized." For the first time in a very long time, Hannah let her own face go. The mask she had worn through 2 Ivy League degrees and a partner track career simply slid off, and underneath was a woman who looked exactly like the small girl who had once held a plastic spoon in front of her sisters in the rain. "I didn't call enough," she said. "I told myself I was protecting him by giving him space. I was protecting myself. I was so afraid of seeing him grow old before I could become someone worth being proud of." Grace had been sitting quietly with her own box. Now she lifted it onto the coffee table. It was full of envelopes, yellowing envelopes addressed in Samuel's careful handwriting, never stamped, never sent. She said in a quiet voice, "These came from Mr. Bennett, Dad's friend at the church. He brought them by yesterday. He said Dad gave them to him over the years and asked him to keep them somewhere safe." They opened the letters. There were dozens. They were dated across 2 decades. Each one was short. Each one began with a date and the words, "My girls." The contents were almost unbearably ordinary. "Today I had rice with dried fish. It was good. What are the 3 of you doing tonight?" Today a student dropped her lunchbox in the hallway and cried, and I gave her a peppermint and she stopped. "I thought of the 3 of you when you were small. Today is your mother's birthday. I miss her. I miss you." They read the letters until the sky outside turned gray. They did not speak. By the time the first light came through the kitchen window, the 3 of them had decided something they had not yet said out loud. Tomorrow they would not be fighting only for a verdict. They would be fighting for a man who had spent 2 decades writing letters he never sent because he was afraid the people he loved most would read them as a request to come home. A father's love does not stop even when his children forget to answer it. There are people in this world who spend their whole lives writing letters they never mail simply because they are afraid of being a burden on the people they love. And when a child finally understands this, there is only one thing left to do. Not to repay the love, because love of that kind cannot be repaid, but to become someone worthy of it in the years that remain. The courtroom on the morning of the final hearing was packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters who had spent 2 months calling Samuel a thief now leaned forward in the back rows with their pens uncapped. St. Mary's parents filled the middle benches, arms crossed, faces hard. Samuel sat at the defendant's table in a borrowed gray suit Grace had pressed for him at 5 in the morning. He had refused to let Hannah serve as his attorney of record. He had told her in the low, stubborn voice she remembered from her childhood that he would not allow his trouble to follow her name onto a court document. So Hannah sat in the gallery with her sisters, and the man at Samuel's table was a friend of hers from law school named David Whitaker, a public defender she had personally briefed for the past 4 nights on a folding table in the kitchen. The prosecutor stood and walked the jury through the evidence with the calm of a man who already knew his closing speech. He showed them the bank records. He showed them the signed authorization with Samuel's name on it. He showed them the pattern of withdrawals. He told them in a quiet, sympathetic tone that this was a sad case, but a clear one, a tired man who had given in to temptation and stolen from children. The jurors looked at Samuel with a mixture of pity and disgust. Samuel kept his hands folded on the table. He did not look away. He had been looked at this way by strangers all his life. When David Whitaker rose for the defense, he did not make a speech. He raised 3 fingers and said, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call evidence in 3 parts. The first part came on a screen. It was a video file. The school's own security cameras had failed that night, but directly across the street from the finance wing was a small family-owned grocery store with a single black and white camera mounted above its back door. Abigail had walked in there 2 weeks earlier with cash in her pocket and asked the owner whether the recordings had been overwritten. They had not. The footage played for the jury. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 at night. The figure walking out of the side door of St. Mary's, briefcase in hand, head turned away from the street, was unmistakably Richard Hales. The earlier sworn statement in evidence said Richard had left the building at 9 in the evening. 2 hours and 47 minutes were missing from his account. 2 hours and 47 minutes during which the cameras inside the building had been turned off. The prosecutor's expression did not change, but his pen had stopped moving. The second part came in the form of an expert witness. Grace took the stand, calm and slow, and she walked the jury through her financial diagrams as if she were teaching a remedial class to her favorite students. She showed them the 7 shell companies. She showed them the layering. She admitted openly that the layering was good. It was professional. It was the work of someone who knew offshore banking very well. But there was one mistake. On the 14th of March, a transfer was logged through the school's main server at 15:23 Eastern Time. The user, however, had logged in from an IP address physically located in Bermuda, where the local time at that exact moment was 16:23. Whoever had executed that transfer had forgotten that his personal laptop was still set to the local Bermuda clock he had used on his last vacation. Grace had subpoenaed the IP records. The address resolved to a private home network. The home belonged to Richard Hales. A small disturbance moved through the courtroom, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it begins to suspect it has been told the wrong story. The third part was not on the witness list, and it almost did not happen. Hannah stood up in the gallery. The judge looked at her over his glasses. David Whitaker stepped aside and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests permission to allow Hannah Carter to address the court in the matter of additional evidence. She is not appearing as defense counsel. She is appearing as a personal witness." The judge studied her for a long moment. He told her to come forward. Hannah walked to the front of the courtroom and laid a thin manila folder on the table. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as if she were reading the evening news. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the man who has spent the last 2 months accusing my father of theft is the same man who killed my mother a quarter of a century ago." The room went absolutely still. Richard Hales rose halfway out of his chair. "This is slander," he said, and his voice cracked across the second word. Hannah opened the folder. She produced the original police report from the October night Eleanor Carter had been struck and killed on a wet road. She produced the partial license plate captured that night. She produced the registration record for a black sedan owned by Richard Hales in the same year. And then she produced one more document, which she had nearly missed, and which Abigail had finally tracked down through a retired family friend in a small assisted living facility outside Cleveland. It was a private letter Richard had written on his own personal stationery to his older brother, a letter that had been kept for many years out of family loyalty and only recently surrendered. In that letter, in his own careful handwriting, Richard had asked his brother how best to handle the matter quietly. And he had admitted that he had been driving after several drinks at the club. Hannah held the letter up so the jury could see the signature. Then she set it down on the railing in front of them. "My father has been called a thief in every newspaper in this county," she said. "What he is and what he has always been is the only man who ever loved my mother. The man who set the trap that put my father in this room is the man who took her away from him. He has sat across the aisle from his own crime for many years. He hoped this trial would bury the last person who could remember her. It will not. Richard sank back into his chair. The fight had left his shoulders entirely. The prosecutor was not looking at the jury. He was looking at the floor. The most dangerous kind of evil is not the kind that explodes in a moment of rage. It is the kind that lives quietly for decades inside a tailored suit that smiles, eats dinner, shakes the hands of strangers, and never trembles. That calm tells you something terrible. It tells you that to such a person, another human life was never quite real. And it is for the people whose lives were taken, the people who can no longer speak for themselves, that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, must always be allowed to come back into the light. Not for revenge, for the simple dignity of an answer. Samuel sat at the defendant's table with his hands flat against the wood, and he was trembling. For all those years, he had not known who killed Eleanor. For all those years, he had raised 3 little girls he had found in an alley, while the man who had taken his wife had eaten in good restaurants and slept in a warm bed. He turned slowly in his chair and looked into the gallery, looking for the only thing in the world that mattered to him in that moment. Hannah was looking back. She gave him the smallest nod. And for the first time in front of strangers, Samuel let a single tear cross the lined skin of his cheek. The jury did not need long. The verdict came back not guilty on every count. Richard Hales was taken into custody before he could leave the courtroom on charges that would soon include vehicular manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement. There is a quiet truth that is rarely spoken. To be cleared by a verdict is not the same as to be made whole. The nights of being doubted, the eyes that turned away in the grocery store, the long hours sitting in a cell, wondering what one had done wrong, those things cannot be returned by the words, "not guilty." But there is one thing that can come close to returning them. It is the moment a person realizes that even in the darkest hour, there were people who never doubted him for a single second. To be trusted in the end may matter even more than to be proven innocent. The drive back to the old house was quiet. The 4 of them rode in Hannah's rental car with the windows half down, letting the spring air come in. The house had not been lived in for some time. Cobwebs hung in the corners of the porch. Dust covered the kitchen table where Samuel had once divided his single piece of meat into 3 small portions. He stood in the middle of the living room with his hands in the pockets of his borrowed suit and did not seem to know what to do with himself. Abigail moved first. She was the youngest and the angriest, and the one who had carried the heaviest stone in her chest for the longest time. She walked across the dusty floor to the man she had walked away from at 16 years old, and she dropped down onto her knees in front of him. She wrapped both arms around his legs the way a much smaller child would, and she said into the fabric of his trousers, "Dad, I'm sorry. I am so sorry for all of it." Samuel bent down. He took her by the shoulders with hands that were thinner now than she remembered, and he lifted her gently to her feet. He looked into her face, the face of the small girl in the rain, the face of the angry teenager on the porch, the face of the woman who had driven through the night to be here, and he said the only thing she had ever needed to hear from him. "I was never angry with you. I was only afraid you wouldn't come back." Grace came up behind him and put her arms around his shoulders, her cheek against the back of his neck, the way she had when she was a small girl, frightened by thunder. Hannah remained where she was in the middle of the room, her arms hanging at her sides as if she did not quite remember what they were for. Samuel turned to her and he opened his arms. It took her a moment to step forward. She had not allowed herself to be held in many years. When she finally moved, she moved fast, and she folded herself against her father's shoulder and made a small broken sound that came from somewhere very deep, and Samuel held her with one hand on the back of her head the way he had held her on the night she would not eat the rice porridge. The 4 of them stood in the dust of the living room as the late afternoon sun came in through the west window, the window Eleanor had always loved best, because the light at that hour fell across the kitchen floor in long, warm bars. Sometime later, when the sun had begun to drop lower, Samuel sat down on the front porch step with a cup of coffee in his hands. The 3 women settled around him without anyone asking them to. Hannah took the old porch swing and pushed it gently with one foot. Grace sat down on the step below her father, leaning against his knee. Abigail sat on the step beside him and rested her head against his shoulder. No one spoke. There was nothing left to be said. Samuel looked up at the sky where the first faint stars were beginning to show. He spoke too quietly for any of them to hear the way a man speaks to someone who is not in the room with him. "Eleanor, do you see them? Our girls came home. There are families that are born, and there are families that are chosen. The chosen ones are sometimes the strongest of all because they are not held together by blood, but by something that is heavier than blood, the daily, deliberate decision to come home, no matter how far away one has gone." Samuel Carter's story is not really the story of a courtroom. It is the story of a man who planted seeds in silence for many long years, and who on the day he believed he had lost everything found that those seeds had grown into the only people in the world capable of standing between him and the dark. Do not measure another human being by the clothes they are wearing, the work they are doing, or the color of their skin. The janitor you walk past every morning, the security guard you have never said hello to, the woman cleaning the floor of the building you work in, they may be carrying inside them a story so vast you would not believe it if you were told. The real worth of a person does not live in what others can see. It lives in what they quietly give when no one is watching. A society is not measured by how it treats the rich. It is measured by how it treats the people it has trained itself to overlook. And if today you are someone who is loved without condition by a parent, a grandparent, an old teacher, anyone who has chosen to stay beside you when you had nothing to offer them, please do not wait for a courtroom or a hospital or a graveside to understand what you have. Go home. Make the call. Today. Right now. Kindness is patient. Time is not. One day when you look back over your life, you will understand that the most precious thing in it was never your success. It was the people who stood beside you long before you had any success at all.